So now I'm going to share. Welcome to the class. And I'm going to share. Okay. So as you can see, this is a picture of Moses and his Ethiopian wife, all right? This is an assumption being made based on chapter 12 of the book of Numbers, where they talk about Haisha HaKushit. We have no idea if she was Ethiopian or not, but this particular painting, 17th century painting, is based on that assumption. And so we're going to look at a text that we actually looked at, I think, a few weeks ago, where Zipporah was mentioned as coming back to Moses after she had been sent home, all right? And we assume that she was sent home after all that had happened, because this is Exodus 18, all right? Pay attention. This is Exodus 18. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. He doesn't show too much interest in his wife. We saw this, I believe, last week, not last week, a few weeks ago. And he came back with the two sons, right? One's name is Gershom, whom we now find his name because he was a stranger in a foreign land. And the other one is Eliezer, meaning that God of my father's house was my help, delivering me from the sword of Pharaoh. Okay, and so this we saw in chapter 18, but now we're going backwards, right? We're going back to chapter 4, all right? For some reason, Moses goes back to his father-in-law. We don't know exactly where he's going back from. Maybe this is after he has everything that has to do with seeing God presumably, seeing God at the burning bush. And he says to him, all right, and notice his name here is Yeter, right? Not Yitro, Yeter, and which is in itself interesting because there are at least 4 or 5 names for Yitro in the Tanakh, all right? And so we never really know, but he's referred to as his father-in-law. And he says to him, I have to go back to my kinsmen in Egypt, see how they're doing. Jethro says to him, Lech b'shalom, all right? And then God speaks to him and tells him, go back to Egypt, for all the men who thought to kill you are dead. And then the next sentence is, and pay close attention to all of this, all right? Pay attention to the fact that we have here death being mentioned, because what I'm trying to understand, if you notice there's something on the bottom of the page in yellow, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. The question is, what is this particular text, which is only 3 verses, what is it doing here? Why does it show up here? Okay, so everyone who sought to kill Moses is dead. He takes his wife, his sons, mounts them on an ass, goes back to the land of Egypt. Moses takes the rod of God with him, all right? Notice, by the way, the word vayikach appears twice, which in itself is interesting. So he has this rod, which we know later on is going to be a very important rod. And God says to him, when you go to Egypt, you're going to perform all sorts of miracles, all right? He tells him, he gives a preview, it's like a soap opera, what's going to happen next week, right? I'm going to stiffen Pharaoh's heart, and then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I have said to you, let my son go, that he may worship me. Yet you refuse to let him go. Now I will slay your firstborn son. This is what we have right before this next very, very strange interlude. And we don't even know what it's doing here, why it's here. There's no mention of it later on, right? However, there are some interesting things here, which we'll go back to see as we go along. So, okay. So this is the plot. And it happened, right? The Hebrew is vayehi. on the way at a lodging place. Now in Hebrew it says b'derech b'malon, and any of you who have been to Israel know that hotels are called malon, right? That's a name for a hotel. But a lodging place could even be a piece of flat dirt. We don't know what a lodging place is, right? At a lodging place, wherever they set their feet and decided to stay, that God met him and sought to kill him. Kill who? Not clear. Presumably Moses. But we just wait a minute. We just were talking about Pharaoh. So why would even think? What does this have to do with killing him? All right. So Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his legs. Again, whose legs? Moses' legs, the son's legs, and said, "You are truly a bridegroom or an in-law." The Hebrew word is chatan, right? A bridegroom of blood to me, right? But also it could be an in-law because a chotain could be like your father-in-law. If you notice the word up here, chotno, which I put in, made it very clear, chotno is father-in-law. So you are truly an in-law or a bridegroom of blood to me. And when he loosened his hold, the question is, who's the he? Now it is capitalized, so we could assume that he is God, right? Since it's capitalized. But the Hebrew doesn't say that. The Hebrew doesn't capitalize. There's no capital letters. It simply says, Vayiref mimenu. So we don't know, is it God who is letting him go, who's loosening the hold? We don't know. She said, when he loosened his hold, she said, a bridegroom or an in-law of blood to the circumcision. What is this? What does this mean? All right. We have this very strange incident happening here. And the big question is, what's going on? And why is it inserted here? Now, I've underlined certain things here, and you may have noticed, what connections do you see with the above text that could help us out here to see why, not to explain the story, but why the story is inserted here? Do any of you have any ideas?
So they'll be able to tell who the firstborn of Egypt versus the firstborn of Israel.
Okay, we've been talking about slaying firstborn sons, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, we don't know who did God try to kill Moses, or is God trying to kill, is he trying to kill the son? And why does she have to cut off her son's foreskin? And is this the assumption that it's the oldest son? Remember, there are two sons.
Mm.
Which son still has the foreskin? Right? It's very, very, it's very confusing. And there's all sorts of interesting theories about this, because there's even a theory that when the firstborn son was born and Moses would like to have circumcised him, but he was still living with his father-in-law, Yitro or Yeter here, and he's a high priest. And I'm not going to have, it's like, if you're a Catholic father today, it's what, you're going to circumcise my kid? Forget about it, and he's not even Jewish, because Zipporah is not a Jewish. I don't have to do this. But by the time it came around to the second born son, they already agreed to circumcise him. And there are all sorts of theories, about who she circumcised and why, and again, touching whose legs and who's in danger here, right? Who's in danger? It's not clear. And also this word, Vayikach Moshe, and Moses took, which is he said here twice, right? He took. And here it says with Zipporah, Vatikach Zipporah, and Zipporah took right? She took the flint. So in other words, you have certain words here which seem to be sort of going back and forth and playing around with this whole idea of a firstborn. Okay, so that's maybe can explain why this is inserted here, okay? But let me give a little bit of a background. Where are we? Oh, wait, before we go to that's too much of a hint. Where are we in terms of, where is Moses in terms of location?
On his way back to
That's
Egypt.
way back, yeah.
He's on a road trip, okay?
Right.
He's on a road trip. And road trips are, even today, but in ancient times, road trips were always very dangerous places. I would even call them, they are liminal spaces, spaces between where you don't know where you are, right? And by the way, even circumcision, you know, the minute you circumcise somebody, he's a Jew. Before the circumcision, he's not a Jew, right? So in other words, the whole idea, we're in a liminal situation, which is dangerous. This could even be a nightmare, right? It could be a dream. We don't really, the whole thing is so strange that we don't really know what's happening here. So it's a liminal situation. Now, another liminal situation involving blood was what? What holiday is coming up? In case you forgot.
Passover.
Okay. And what is Passover?
Blood on the doorpost.
Right, blood on the doorpost. Thank you,
Right.
Debbie. Okay, so we have here, if there's blood on the doorpost, you won't be killed. Your firstborn, all the firstborn children are going to be killed unless you happen to have put blood on the doorpost. Okay, so now just coming back to what Debbie just pointed out. All right, so we have the whole passage of in chapter 12, right? We just were in chapter, notice we're jumping around in Exodus. So we started in 18, then we went to 4, and now we're jumping in between to 12, all right? And so we have here that God says he's going to strike down every firstborn, but if you put the blood on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel, and God will see the blood, he will pass over, right? Pasachti, and that's where you get the word Pesach from, passed over, right? I will pass over you and no scourge, all right? So, and then there's a whole detail of what to do. And then God is not going to allow the destroyer to come into your house to squat, all right? And then afterwards, what happened? God strikes down every firstborn, and there was no household in which there was no death. Okay, we know that story too well. Okay, here's an interesting picture of circumcision. You can see people being circumcised. Okay, maybe it's too graphic here, but you can really clearly see the penis is here. You can see the instrument, all right? And then presumably this is the beginning, this is the second part, and presumably this is the third part, right? So you have here circumcision and basically identified spelling. Okay. So you have, this is a papyro, all right? And it was found in a tomb, and it shows men being circumcised, all right? And the guy who is kneeling is actually saying, I will proceed carefully. And finally, the man doing the restraining, I guess he's restraining him over here, all right, is saying, hold him fast, do not let him faint, while the restrainer says, I will do as you wish. So this is a very interesting picture of circumcision being done in Egyptian time. And here you have here in Haggadah, you have here Vayikach Moshe et Mata HaElohim biyado Vatikach Vayikach Zipporah Tzor Vatikach. Now, by the way, what's really interesting, so this is this picture from the Haggadah. I don't remember what Haggadah is from, right? But you have here a depiction of them, right? They're here, they're on the donkey traveling, and then here you have the picture of the blood and her taking whatever's, the whole bloody scene. And if you just notice, again, vayikach and vatikach, there's an emphasis here on the person doing the drawing is emphasizing by the taking, all right? They're paying attention to what I just showed you before of the taking, of the actual, just like he takes a makel, rod, just like he takes a rod, she takes a flint. She takes a Flintstone. But so she has agency in this particular story. Unlike the depiction in, so this is what it looks like, right? This is the Ryland's Haggadah. And so you have here, this is the page that I took it from, mid-1300s Catalan. And here you have the different stories, the burning bush, the staff, the healing of Moses' arm, and return to Egypt, and Zipporah circumcising her son. Okay. So I have here a whole list of questions to which there are no real answers. I've been asking them as we're going along. And last year, when I taught this, some of you actually gave me a few answers. So when I asked who was the deity seeking to kill Moses, his son, Sue Reese, who's not here today, said he was circumcising his firstborn son so he won't be killed in the future. Right? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say before, Naomi, that
Okay,
they
good.
were circumcising him so they'd know that he was to be not,
Okay, good. That's great. Okay. Why was he trying to kill whoever it was? Whose legs did Zipporah touch? And then notice the whole euphemism about feet. When we're talking about feet, we're not probably talking about feet. We're probably talking about the same area where the circumcision has been taken, all right? And then whose feet did she throw the foreskin at, right? And who is she speaking to? Who is she speaking to? It's not clear, right? And what provoked the attack, right? Why should they be attacked? Moses is following God's orders. Is that nice of God to attack him? Not very nice, is it? All right. What saves the child? These are all question marks. The circumcision, the touching of the legs, Zipporah's pronouncement, all of the above, perhaps none of it. Why? All right. And then, is God's anger really appeased by circumcision? Another question. Right? And also, how come it's Zipporah who sprung into action, not Moses? Again, what is the meaning of the bloody husband or bloody bridegroom? What kind of is this marriage? Right? What are we talking about? Right? And again, blood bridegroom. Are we talking about marriage? There should be blood when you have marriage, when you have the first sex. All right. What is the connection between circumcision, blood, which may or may not be that of circumcision, and the in-law relationship between two families, presupposed by the term chatan, in-law? Okay, lots and lots of questions. All right. And then finally, the connection between the blood on the lintels during the makat. Okay, I have no answers to any of these questions. I just raise them as questions, but it's a fascinating text. All right. Now there are some answers found in the midrash, and if you go into, I took this is from Tamar Kadari in the JWA.org encyclopedia. It's the Shalvi Hyman Haggadah, which is a wonderful resource. I always mention it. And so you do have some answers found in the midrash. And so you have here Af and Chema. the destructive angels of wrath and anger came and swallowed Moses, leaving only his legs. This is midrash, right? How did Zipporah know that Moses' life was threatened because of the circumcision? When she saw that they swallowed him until the place of circumcision. In other words, they swallow him from top, right? And only his legs are sticking out till the, right? On the place. She understood the danger. In other words, there was a hint. She took a place of flint, she cut off her son's foreskin, and voila, right? The destructive angels relinquished her hold, okay? All right, the first one I mentioned to you before, the midrash about Moses asking Jethro to marry his daughter. And so Jethro said, okay, you can have him, but the first son born to you shall be for idolatry, meaning he won't be circumcised, and your following sons will be for heaven. Okay, so that explains why one son was uncircumcised, all right? And only when they left Jethro's home was Moses released from his vow, and God wants him to take care of it right away because, you know, a brit is very important. Okay, and the other thing is really fascinating about Zipporah, which is that there's a whole discussion in the Talmud about a woman performing circumcision, right? And they say it's okay for women to perform circumcision. And so then they base the story on the story of Zipporah. And I don't know if any of you have come across women, but usually they're doctors, but if you've come across women who've studied and have learned all that they need to do, I believe there are some graduates at the JTS. You're nodding your head, Debbie. Women who are, all right, who have performed circumcision. They usually are also doctors as well, but they took a special course and they graduated a couple of years ago. I remember reading about this. Okay, so we're going to skip some things because we have an interesting midrash. All right, so you have here, you have here something really very interesting in the Torah.com, where Moses, and this is a picture, 17th century picture, Moses ordering the slaughter of the Midianites, all right? And so when it says a murderous son-in-law, this is the description in the article in the Torah.com by Serge Frolov, who wrote the article. Moses' relationship with Zipporah's family undergoes a macabre twist. Despite being an in-law of a Midianite priest, he acts in Numbers 31 as an executor of God's order to attack Midian. They leave all Midianite men dead and all women and children taken as spoils, with no exceptions mentioned for Jethro and most of his family. So that the phrase that Moses is a murderous son-in-law, it actually is, let's go back to the phrase, just in case you forgot. Back to the phrase. All right. Chatan damim lemulat, right? She says you are a bridegroom in law of blood, right? In other words, you are a murderer, right? This is the idea. You are a bridegroom of murder. And so this is Frollo's understanding. This is his understanding. For them, Moses truly becomes a murderous son-in-law. Therefore, it must have been him that Zipporah described as such, okay? And it must have been his legs that she touched after circumcising Gershom, perhaps to remind Moses of his own circumcision. Isn't that fascinating? So that that he manages to understand, based on his study, that the murderous son-in-law is actually Moses, which is really very interesting. And then you have this whole picture here, a very well-known picture, where Moses' journey into Egypt and the circumcision of his son. So you have the whole journey, which ends up over here, right? You look me from this way to this way, and here we're coming closer and closer. You could see the sons, and here you actually have the circumcision, all right? And it's the same picture, but you actually have the circumcision. And now we come to the midrash. This is a collection of tales by Jonathan Kirsch, 1997. He has a lot of explanation in chapter 8, and in chapter 9 he has a midrash. It's called The Harlot by the Side of the Road, and forbidden tales of the Bible. And you may know of Jonathan Kirsch, and he has a couple of books here of interest that you might want to look into. And the last one was The Short, Strange Life of Herschel Greenspan, which I did not read, but actually looks interesting. Maybe I should look for it. Okay, and so his whole story is based on these 3 verses that we saw. I'm going to intersperse it with pictures, but I need 12 readers. So let me just stop for 1 minute before we begin. And do we have 12 readers? So we have Lita. Some of you are going to have to read twice. Okay. So Lisa, you don't want to read. You're shaking your head. No. Okay. Louise, 1. Barbara, 2. Debbie, 3. Toby, 4. Susan, 5. Norman, 6. Francine, do you want to read? Okay, so you're 7. Geraldine, 8. Joyce, 9. Ariella, you want to read? You're still here? Okay, I'll make you
Still
read.
here, but if you have other people to read, it's
No,
you're better off.
I need 12
Oh.
readers. It's good for you to practice your
Okay.
English. Okay, Ariella, 10. Stevie, I don't know if you're in there or not.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, so I think you're 11. And who will we give the last reader? Norman, I will give you 12, okay? So all of you have to stay on here till we finish the story. Okay, so remember your numbers, all of you remember. I actually numbered it this time since it's 12. So all of you remember your numbers. Okay, so let me share the screen again. Share screen. Okay.
Okay. You want me to start? Yes.
Yes.
The flames in the fire pit threw shadows against the walls of the tent where Zipporah's husband and baby slept. But Zipporah lay wide awake on the pile of bedding that all 3 of them shared, gazing at the ghostly figures that seemed to dance and leap across the taut fabric. Only that morning, Zipporah had stood in the family compound in the hills of Midian and bidden farewell to her father and 6 sisters. Father, a priest of the Midianites, had been no less stern and solemn than if he were presiding over some ritual offering to the ever-demanding gods, although Zipporah had detected a slight hoarseness in his voice that betrayed some sorrow. Her sisters wept openly, and she heard the keening sound of their voices for a long time after she turned, her infant son in her arms, and followed her husband down the rocky path that pointed in the direction of Egypt. Now she found herself alone with her husband and baby at a sparse oasis far from her home. They had trekked from sunrise to sundown, her husband driving a pair of pack asses ahead of them. The moon had already risen when they came to a muddy watering hole and a couple of strangled palms that served as a lodging place for travelers on the caravan route through the desert. On the far side of the pool were a cold fire, a pile of camel droppings, the shards of a shattered wine jar, all signs that someone else had recently paused here, but not a living soul could be seen. At odd moments, a gust of wind would howl through the oasis, stirring up little whirlwinds of sand. Then it was still and quiet again.
Zipporah gathered a few sticks of wood, built a cooking fire, and prepared a pot of porridge, while her husband watered and tied up the asses, unpacked and raised their tent. Then he joined her and the baby at the fire pit for a hasty evening meal. They ate without speaking, as if silenced by the terrible dangers of the journey they had undertaken. Now and then, when the baby fretted, Zipporah loosened her cloak and gave him a breast to quiet him down. While the fire is still burning in the pit, with the fire still burning in the pit, a faint candle in the vast darkness of the desert, they retreated to their tent for the night. Soon she heard the rhythmic breathing of her slumbering husband and baby, one loud and one faint. The shadows on the wall caught Zipporah's eye and forbade her to sleep. She thought of the tales that she had heard as a child from a woman of her father's clan, a crone who told fearsome stories in a voice that hissed like a serpent. The stories came back to her now of gods who demanded unspeakable pleasures from young women who had not yet known a man, demons who set their mouths upon the mouths of innocents and sucked the life out of them while they slept, fat and foul-smelling creatures who oozed up from muddy pools and swallowed strong men right down to their feet. Zipporah shuddered as if in the grip of a fever, then pulled a corner of the bedding around her shoulders to warm herself against the cold desert air.
By the way, notice that he knows about the midrash of swallowing strong men right down to their feet. Go on. Next.
Zipporah glanced at her husband as he slept, one arm curled around the slumbering infant. He was a kind man, but a strangely quiet one who seemed to hold a great many secrets in his heart. He had the bearing of a prince, although his rough hands and his muscled arms and legs clearly belonged to a shepherd whose flock grazed on the steepest and rockiest of mountainsides. He spoke in the refined language of a prince, but he did not speak very often because it took so much effort to suppress his stammer. His name sounded faintly like a name from far-off Egypt, but he insisted that he was not an Egyptian. Yet plainly enough, he was a stranger among the Midianites, and when their first son was born, he insisted on naming the infant Gershom, a word that meant a stranger there in her husband's native tongue. She recalled the day when she first encountered her husband, a day that seemed very far off to her now. Zipporah and her sisters had driven their father's flock to a well, some distance from their father's compound, where they customarily drew water for the sheep and filled the water jars for the household. They began to fill the watering troughs. When the troughs were full, two boisterous young shepherds appeared over the rise of the hill, driving their flocks before them, and one of them pushed Jethro's 7 daughters aside. "We'll water ourselves and our beasts first," said the bolder of the two shepherds to Zipporah with a laugh and a leer. "But don't run away. We'll have some pleasure with you when we're done."
So here we can see the daughters of Jethro. And here we see that Moses is going to be defending, right, the daughters of Jethro. Okay, go on. Number 4.
Zipporah and her sisters had seen them before, the tall, gangly, pimple-faced one who never spoke, and the short, thick, pig-nosed one who taunted them and touched them in insulting ways. And as before, Jethro's daughters began to move away from the well in order to put some distance between themselves and their tormentors. Sometimes they were forced to wait all day in the cleft of some nearby wadi, out of sight of the shepherds, listening to the sounds of the short one's braying laughter, until the young men tired of their game and moved off. But on that memorable day, as Zipporah summoned her sisters away from the well, a stranger's voice was suddenly heard from a shady spot under an outcropping of rock, and a man bearing a stout wooden staff stepped out of the shadows. "Stand back," the man shouted at the two shepherds, without a trace of the stammer that Zipporah would later hear in quieter moments, "and let the maidens finish watering their flocks." All of them, Jethro's daughters and the bullying shepherds, looked up in surprise. What they saw was a young man whose tattered and dusty clothing did not conceal his strength, a man who stood as proud and erect as a prince of Egypt, even if it was quite obvious that he had been traveling alone through rough country like a fugitive on the run. He drove off the shepherds with a single threatening gesture of his staff raised high in a clenched fist. Then, as the flock watered at the troughs, he drew more water from the well, pulling up one bucketful after another with his strong arms. When Jethro's daughters returned to their father's house, they were giggling to each other about the stranger who had rescued them from their old tormentors.
How is it, Jethro asked, that you have come back so soon today? An Egyptian chased away the shepherds who always bother us at the well, said the youngest of Jethro's daughters. He even drew water for us, said another, and watered the flock, a third one interrupted. Jethro nodded and pulled at his long beard, then looked sharply at Zipporah, his eldest daughter. Where is he then? Asked Jethro. Why did you leave the man? Ask him in to break bread. So it was that the stranger came to Jethro's house, broke bread with the priest and his 7 daughters, and accepted Jethro's offer to stay with them and tend his flocks. The man had few words for any of the young women, but he accompanied Jethro on long walks into the countryside, and Jethro learned a great deal about him and how he had been born the son of an Israelite slave in Egypt, but raised in the court of Pharaoh himself, how he had witnessed the beating of a slave by one of Pharaoh's taskmasters, how he had struck down the taskmaster and then fled to the wilderness of Midian to escape the wrath of Pharaoh and the certain punishment that would be inflicted upon him. Jethro offered the stranger a safe refuge in the land of Midian, and not much later, the hand of his eldest daughter in marriage. Only then did Zipporah learn the name of the stranger, the man who would be her husband and the father of her children. He was called Moses.
A sudden noise from just outside the tent, a hiss and a rattle like a serpent arching to strike, interrupted Zipporah's thoughts and sent a chill through her body. She sat up with a start, her heart racing. Moses, she whispered, but her husband did not stir, and the baby only snuffled and then fell silent again. She heard the rustle of flesh against cloth as someone or something moved against the fabric of the tent, and she imagined that she saw an odd bulge that moved slowly but steadily toward the tent opening. A wheezing noise reached her ears, the sound of labored breathing, but it came from neither her husband nor her baby. A stench that reminded her of the greasy smoke that poured from the altar when her father sacrificed a bloody hunk of flesh to the gods wafted into the tent. Husband, she said again, and again he did not stir. Now she recalled the strange tale that her husband had told her when he first announced that he must return to Egypt and asked her to accompany him. Moses had been tending Jethro's flocks on a mountainside in the wilderness when he saw a strange sight, a bush that burned with fire but did not burn up. Then he heard a voice that seemed to come out of the bush, a voice that announced itself as the God of your fathers, a God whose name was Yahweh, a God who demanded that Moses go back to the place where his own people were enslaved, the place where he had killed the Egyptian taskmaster, the place where Pharaoh sought his life. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, the voice said from within the burning bush, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. Zipporah would have laughed at her husband's tale if he had not told it to her in such a plain-spoken and quiet voice. She noticed that his stammer disappeared, and she marked the urgency in his voice when he asked her to return with him to Egypt. Without allowing herself to think much about the implications of her husband's tale, was Moses truly called by the God of Israel? Was he jesting? Was he mad? She agreed to undertake the long, difficult, and perilous journey from the sheltered wilderness of Midian to the land of the Egyptians and the mighty Pharaoh.
In case I forget to come back to this, just that I thought this was funny. An odd bulge and moved slowly but steadily toward the tent opening. It looks very suggestive. Okay, 7th reader.
Now she could no longer drive the mounting terror from her breast. The spirits and demons of her own people were so familiar to Zipporah that they had lost the power to frighten her. But her husband was a stranger whose curious ways seemed grotesque and dangerous. Among her own people, for example, a man was circumcised when he reached his 13th year. When he was old enough to take a bride and strong enough to endure the circumciser's knife. But Moses insisted that a son must be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth, when the child was still frail and vulnerable to every sort of peril. This is what the God of my father demands, she told Zipporah's father on one of their long walks. And Jethro later complained to Zipporah, "What barbaric people to circumcise so young." And there was the whole matter that had been left by her father and her husband. But now Zipporah found herself seized with anxiety at the thought that her infant son lay beside her with his foreskin intact on that tiny bit of flesh between his fat little thighs. Perhaps she had been wrong to allow her father to argue with Moses over the matter of the circumcision. Perhaps she had placed them all in terrible danger by allowing her son to remain uncircumcised. After all, what might be the strange and demanding God of the Israelites do to them if they had defied his commandments? A sound that Zipporah could not recognize now reached her ear. A sound that might have been water running over stones, or the night wind in the branches of a palm. Her eyes were drawn to the opening of the tent, and there she saw a silvery mist reaching into the tent, moving over the ground like a morning fog, except that it glowed with a light that resembled the glare of the full moon. Pouring into the tent, swelling like a freshening stream, the mist surrounded the bedding upon which Zipporah, Moses, and Gershom lay, as if on an island of clouds in a thick silver lake. How pretty, Zipporah thought to herself, suddenly calm and even enchanted by the sight and sound. She wanted to wake her husband, not out of fear, but to show him what she beheld. But the mist filled her throat and prevented her from speaking.
Okay, and here we have, we've seen lots of his pictures, Nahum Halevi's pictures. Here we have his version of this. It's a little blurry, but it's really, you can see.
Well, that's yeah.
Okay, you can see, okay. Let's go on. Eighth reader.
Now a figure seemed to rise up out of the swirling mist, and Zipporah beheld the shape of a man, or something like a man, and yet not a man at all. The figure began to swell up like a corpse that had been in water too long, and then she saw its mouth open wide to reveal 2 rows of yellowed and twisted donkey teeth, in which she saw bits of flesh and bone, eyeballs, fingertips, fragments that could be recognized as bloody pieces of lung and scalp and kidney. Zipporah watched in silent terror as the mouth slowly closed around her sleeping husband, drawing into that vast maw his head and his feet, his arms and his legs, his chest and his thighs, until only a single organ of his body was still visible, the organ with which Moses had first implanted a seed in her womb. Zipporah woke from the nightmare with a start. Her eyes burned, her head ached. She shuddered as she remembered the enormous jaws that had closed around her husband's body, and then, to her immense relief, she looked around the tent and saw that her husband was still asleep next to her, and her baby was still safely nestled in the crook of his arm. Perhaps I do have a fever, Zipporah thought to herself, and she snuggled comfortably under the fold of the bedding. Then Zipporah heard a snigger with someone standing inside the tent. Someone standing so near to her that she could hear his breathing, and she knew that she was no longer dreaming.
The ninth reader?
Joyce. Is Joyce there?
Yeah. His laughter reminded Zipporah of the pig-nosed shepherd who had tormented her and her sisters when they watered their flock at the well. And the mad thought occurred to her that it was the young bully who was in the tent with them now. "Who are you?" she said, choking out the words. "What do you want?" The intruder did not speak, glanced around the tent to see if she might find something to use as a weapon, her husband's new walking staff, perhaps, or a spare tent stake, but neither was within sight or reach. On the tent floor were the supplies she had used to prepare their evening meal. A water jug, a pouch of milled flour, a tiny jar of oil, a little bundle of kindling, a Flintstone that she had used to strike a spark and start the cooking fire. Then suddenly something moved quickly through the still air in the tent. Zipporah felt the slightest breeze, but still saw only a shadow. But now Moses awoke with a start, sat up awkwardly, and raised his arms as if to defend himself against a blow. The baby tumbled out of his arm and rolled to the ground, crying out in surprise and indignation. Zipporah sensed rather than saw the attack on her husband. Somehow, without quite knowing why, she realized that the intruder, whoever or whatever it was, had come to kill him. At that moment, Zipporah dived to the floor where the cooking supplies were neatly arranged, and she snatched the Flintstone in her right hand. She felt the jagged edge of the stone with one finger. Was it sharp enough, she wondered, to cut the attacker? Would a blow or even a knife cut be enough to stop him? Or would something else be needed, some more potent magic to stave off the ghostly figure in the shadows? She wished she had something longer or sharper at hand, a long-bladed knife like the one Jethro used to slit the throats of the bleeding sheep that were led to the sacrificial altar, or even the short, sharp blade that was used to circumcise a young Midianite man before his marriage to a virgin bride. But the Flintstone was all she had now, and she would inflict as much damage on the attacker, draw as much blood as the jagged edge would allow.
Okay, so here we see another picture of the circumcision of the son of Moses. You can see the thread. Okay, the 10th reader.
Yeah, that's me. As Zipporah raised the stone and looked around for the attacker, you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Looked around for the attacker, she heard
How are you?
two anguishing noises. Her husband's strangled cry. Oh, good. Strangled cry, as if the attacker were already on top of him, and the sharper cry of their infant son, who lay helplessly on his back, arms and legs flailing, shrieking in panic. A strange image from her fever dream suddenly formed in Zipporah's mind at the sound of her baby's desperate cry. The image of her husband swallowed up in the mouth of the demon, the whole of his body captured between ravening jaws, except one crucial limb. And then she recalled the angry words that her husband and her father had exchanged over the circumcision of Zipporah's newborn son. Now Zipporah burned with the urgent knowledge that Moses and not her father must have been right. The God that Moses worshipped, the God that had summoned Moses and sent him on the road to Egypt, demanded the flesh and blood of the firstborn sons of his chosen people. And yet their own child was alive and intact. The intruder in the tent, angel or devil, or perhaps God himself, was bent on punishing Zipporah's husband and son for disregarding what Moses had always insisted was a holy ritual. Zipporah did not understand why the tiny foreskin of an infant boy, a bit of flesh not bigger than the tip of her little finger, was so important to the deity that Moses called all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-seeing, but she realized that it no longer mattered why. All that mattered now, Zipporah told herself in that moment, was to confront the attacker and turn him away. Zipporah crawled to her baby's side, pulled off the swaddling, and fumbled to find the tiniest and most delicate part of his small body. The baby fell silent for a moment, so that all that Zipporah heard were the muffled gasps of her husband on the bedding behind her, on the beating behind her. Bedding.
She bit her lower lip, squinted in the darkness, and then pressed the edge of the flint against the flesh, timidly at first, but then with greater force when she realized that the edge was not sharp enough to cut quickly or smoothly. Her baby gasped and then cried out angrily, but Zipporah persisted. Then suddenly she saw that she held a bit of flesh in her hands and that her hands were stained with blood. So much blood, she thought to herself, from such a tiny bit of flesh. Zipporah stood and turned, but she saw that the intruder had not broken off the attack of her husband, whose desperate cries seemed quieter now, as if the attacker was choking off the last breath of life in his body. Amid the bedding on the tent floor, now in even greater disarray, Zipporah saw flailing limbs, but she could not make out the shadowy darkness, whether they belonged to the attacker or Moses or both. But Zipporah realized that her husband's all-powerful God had not yet noticed the blood ritual that she had just performed, or if he had noticed, he did not seem to care. Zipporah still held the bloody foreskin delicately between her thumb and first finger, and now she stepped forward and thrust the flesh between the legs that flexed and kicked as Moses struggled against the attack. She drew the foreskin down one leg and then the other, painting a bright red smear of fresh blood on each limb. Just as she had seen her father anoint an arm, a hand, a face with the blood of a freshly sacrificed lamb. Zipporah could not be sure whether the blood-smeared legs belonged to Moses or his attacker, but she figured with a kind of crazed logic, that if the cutting of flesh and the shedding of blood were what the attacker wanted, the sight of fresh blood might be enough to call his attention to the fact that the child, had been circumcised. Fresh flesh had been cut, blood had been shed.
Good. Okay, last one.
Then Zipporah was called back to her baby by his staccato cries, each one punctuated with a gasp. She saw that his face was slightly blue, but the fresh wound that she had just inflicted was no longer bleeding. Quickly, and with far greater deftness than she had displayed with the flint, Zipporah swaddled him tightly, lifted him into her arms, bared one breast, and gave him to suck. The infant sighed, snorted, snuggled into his mother's bosom, and suckled rhythmically on her teat. Within a moment or two, he was fast asleep. Zipporah looked up at the scene of the struggle. and she saw that the flailing of limbs atop the bedding had ceased. All was perfectly quiet and still inside the tent. Moses was lying on his back, his arms splayed out, his clothing disheveled, but his breathing was deep and steady. Zipporah watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. He was asleep and alone. The intruder, whoever or whatever he had been, if he had truly been there at all, was gone. Gershom stirred briefly in her arms. She gave him the other breast, and soon he slept again. Zipporah gazed at her infant son, whose swaddling showed a tiny spot of red from the blood of the circumcision, and then at her husband, whose exposed legs were painted with crude stripes of blood that was now turning brown and crusty. Surely a bridegroom of blood art thou unto me, Zipporah said aloud, mimicking the solemn words and phrases of the priestly incantations that her father recited at the sacrificial altar. And then, as if to explain herself, she added, a bridegroom of blood on account of the circumcision. The slumbering Moses did not hear her words, nor was Zipporah sure that he would understand them if he did.
Okay, so this, first of all, what to you all is the most amazing about this story? Joyce, I muted you before because you were talking. You have to unmute.
The strength of Zipporah. She's
Okay.
amazing. She's amazing.
Okay.
I think
Well,
it's
that's-
amazing that basically she's the one who sees God.
Yes.
So
Yes.
she's the one
who connects
who
to
connects,
the
right?
deity.
Okay. Anything else that you noticed here? I mean, just throw out your thoughts because I think it's a fascinating story.
He's not entirely sure what's happening or if anything is happening or if she's
Right.
Dreaming.
a horrible nightmare.
Right.
But she does do the circumcision.
Yes, she does.
Right. Right. But there is this dream-like,
Quality.
When we talked about the liminality, right? When you're dreaming, right? You're half awake and half sleeping,
Yeah.
the whole idea.
And also the connection she had in her mind with the stories growing up and what she was seeing now, which was the Midianite legacy, I guess. I don't know what else to
Right.
call it.
Right. So bringing in the pagan, in quotation marks, right? The pagan, because we shouldn't use the word today, pagan. It's not very, inclusive, right? That's implying that other people's, customs are wrong. But I'll use the word here. All right. So that her pagan upbringing really is what influences her to act, right? And the things she recalls from her household, including some of the statements she makes, are based what she learned in the non-Jewish home, right? So that also is very interesting. And also, I thought, which I underlined, and some of you, laughed as I was underlining. There are a couple of things. It's very phallic imagery in the. Okay, Barbara, thanks. So there's a lot of phallic imagery here, right? There's, the coming through the tent or the stream, right? The stream coming through the opening. I mean, there's a lot of phallic stuff going on there, which itself is also interesting. And the fact that she thinks that perhaps the son, not the son, that the one is that pig-faced, the pig-faced person, I mean, who may have tried to rape her. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there in the background, this threatening image, which, I think he's done a fantastic job. And to me, the most interesting of everything is that he built the story from 3 verses. 3 verses. And he has some background from the midrash, and he puts a little bit of background in there from the past, right? To flesh out the story. By the way, do you think he needed all of that to flesh out? I always ask people, do you think it takes away from the story to have the background?
No. I think it adds to it. It gives you a context in a way of what she's thinking and feeling.
By
Okay,
the
good.
way,
Okay.
the context is amazing. Being in a tent in Nowheresville, in the desert, it's cold, it's amazing. The creation of this context.
Right.
Very
And
descriptive.
let me just find the there's one description which really is just like unbelievable. I underlined the whole passage. Let me see, where did I underline it? Well, one of them was here. Let me just share it again with you. One of them was we're a little bit over time, but it's just if you have to leave, you have to leave. One of them was this was, I said, was also very phallic. A silvery mist reaching into the tent, right? A light that resembled the glare of the full moon pouring into the tent, swelling like a flame, right? You have the whole thing, which is also very, and then the mist filled her throat and prevented her from speaking. So in other words, it's almost like a rape scene there. But there was another one that really caught my eye. No, this also was interesting. The sharp blade. No, but there was one ill. Well, first of all, I think what's really interesting is there's a little bit of critique here of God, if you noticed, right?
Yeah.
That God demands, right, cutting on flesh and, and shedding of blood, that this is, there's a critique of the whole idea of circumcision, right? So I think the fact that God wants blood and he wants this is it's almost like, the Akedah, that God wants an Akedah, and test you. But there was one other thing which I thought I underlined very heavily, which was very descriptive. Maybe I didn't press down on it. No, I didn't press down on it. There was one really descriptive thing there where really so totally creepy and scary. Maybe it was this here. The tales that she heard. I think this was what it was here. Look at this just again. I forgot to press forward, right? Here, this whole thing here. Demons set their mouths upon the mouths of innocents, sucked the life out of them while they. I mean, this is really creepy stuff. This is not, this is not a story you want to tell, a bedtime story you want to tell to your grandchildren.
Not Bible stories for children.
Not even for us.
Right. So anyway, I just, I don't know if we ever read this in the past. I had it here, but I'm not so sure we ever read it. But maybe we did. I might have skipped over a lot of it. Yeah, Francine.
Well, it was interesting to me that God swallowed all of Moshe except his penis. And the author was providing a hint to Zipporah about what she had to do.
And he's basing that on the midrash, right? He's basing that on the midrash. And there's actually a picture someplace. I don't remember. I remember coming across the picture. I don't remember where I came across it, where you actually have him being swallowed down to that point. You could probably Google it and maybe find it. Okay. Any other comments before we leave?
Well, her last sentence is something. You really are a bridegroom of blood.
Right.
Wow.
So he really studied the text very carefully. I mean, it's clear. Studied the text so carefully. And in the end, came up with this amazing imagination. So you might want to look for his book. I mean, I don't know if I downloaded his book years ago. I have no idea. I'd have to look. But I've been getting rid of it slowly, so I'm not sure if I still have his book.
I could have done without the description of the teeth, though.
It was pretty gory.
Yeah, it was. It was pretty disgusting.
Very gory.
But I've read that story somewhere. That story is